Hi my loves, welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing my May, June and July books video. We're actually a week off the end of July, but I thought seeing as there's been such a delay on this video, I would just include everything I've read so far in July. Should I finish one or two more books by the end of the week, hopefully you'll see them in my Substack post. So it being 3 months worth of books, it's an enormous pile. Oh my goodness. Oh. As you can see, it's rather big and I'm struggling to hold it. The reason there's such a delay on this video is that I actually filmed the May and June books video and I got about 99% there with editing it. It was almost ready to go and then I decided that I hated it and wanted to scrap it. Just didn't do the books justice, didn't talk about them the way I wanted. At least by including July's books, if you have read both my roundups on Substack for May and June, you can at least enjoy some new reviews today. We're going to start with the book club books. I haven't actually read July's yet, so that'll be coming in the next video. And then we're going to go more or less from the books I most liked, least liked, as usual. But unlike other months, I mostly enjoyed everything I read, and yet few things were like absolutely perfect, so it was a bit more difficult to put them in any sort of order. So this is not a definitive ranking of these books, but certainly I have one or two favourites which I'm looking forward to talking to you about. But before we get into the rest of the video, let me quickly introduce today's sponsor, which is HelloFresh. So thank you HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. As I'm sure many of you know, HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service, and it is so convenient for us as a family to have these recipes and kits ready to go of an evening after a busy day. Everybody's hungry, everybody's tired, everybody just wants to eat good food, and we have been loving HelloFresh. Really helps us keep that routine of eating together as a family as well. There's lots of toddler friendly and family friendly options on there, and it just keeps us eating quick, easy, but fresh and healthy home cooked food. And by exactly portioning how much we're actually going to eat, it stops us from overbuying on ingredients we just never end up using. So you can use the QR code on screen or my code SUNBEAM6025 for 60% off your first box, 25% off your boxes for the next 2 months, and free dessert for life. Obviously there'll be a link in the description box as well, but for now, let's get back into the video. Let's start with June's book club pick, which was East Eden by John Steinbeck. This is a much loved classic and I was very much looking forward to reading it, having heard so many good things about it. Before this, I'd only read Of Mice and Men, and I found the reading of this just so enjoyable. We talked for well over 3 hours about it across 2 meetings for book club. So it's difficult for me to edit my thoughts down into something short and sweet, and I am going to try to be short and sweet-ish today because we have a lot of books to get through. So first of all, what is it about? It is about 2 families living in the Salinas Valley in California. It's set around the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. So a formative period for America at large, and this book is very much so part of that myth-making of America, I think. It's one of the interesting things about it. One of these families is actually based on Steinbeck's own family, his own maternal grandparents and their children. And the other family is entirely fictional and recreates to some degree 2 stories from Genesis, Adam and Eve obviously, but primarily Cain and Abel, which actually gets repeated 2 times. Steinbeck wrote a lot about writing this book, which I think is quite interesting. One of the things he said about this book was that he was addressing it to his sons, both to tell them about their family history and also to tell them how to be good in the world, hence the use of the biblical stories and the fact of the novel struggling with so many ideas about good and evil, about nature versus nurture, and how to break harmful cycles, how to be a good father, how to be a good son. Even though this book is 600 pages long, that is still a lot of material for Steinbeck to cover. This book is a little chaotic and it makes it quite strange and unique in ways that me as a literature nerd really enjoys. I don't think it makes it a perfect novel or perfectly crafted, but it was nonetheless so fascinating to read how he managed this strange first-person narration from a Steinbeckian point of view, putting these 2 families together whose stories kind of cross, but also not really, and also putting in so much philosophizing, moralizing, history of America stuff, biblical allegory. It becomes a little unwieldy, but in quite a lovable way. Although it is chunky, I raced through it with ease. Steinbeck writes a fantastic sentence. He kept me interested. It was compelling. And yet the flaws of this novel were some of the bits that I most enjoyed and found most interesting. Like this strange intrusion of the author upon the narration. Like the character of Kaveh, who has been criticised for being two-dimensional. She's one of the main female characters in the book and she is basically pure evil. We talked about her for ages in book club, rescuing her from inhumanity despite what Steinbeck may have thought, finding awkward and strange moments in the text that may talk back to some of that. Speaking from a purely critical point of view, I think it's a pretty flawed novel, but speaking as a lover of literature, I think it's a fantastic novel. I think it's so interesting, it's so ripe for discussion, it's so iconic. Being so iconic also makes it interesting in terms of its impact both at the time and today, the ways it's been interpreted, and despite its flaws, it is an enjoyable read. I was moved by it, taken with it. The first chapter is probably one of my favourites. The description of the Salinas Valley is so beautiful. He really evokes that sense of place really well, I think. I'm looking forward to The Grapes of Wrath. It's his more critically acclaimed novel, but this one is so personal. It really strikes me as a personal, vulnerable novel from Steinbeck, and that's something I can also appreciate in my books. So that is East of Eden. We really enjoyed reading it together. Next we have The Mercies, which was our May book club pick, by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave. It is 1617 on the island of Vardo in Norway, and all the men in the village go out hunting a whale. A freak storm hits and kills them all, leaving just the women behind. And then a couple of years later, some witch trials are held there. Both of these events really happened. Obviously they seem linked in some way, from the storm through to the trials, and Hargrave crafts a narrative around that. So what did I like about it? I thought the writing was really nice and really beautiful, turns of phrase here. I think Hargrave is great on a story level. She writes children's literature, and I think you can tell because she does have plot and it moves and it's compelling and you want to see where it goes and what happens next. All round, I can see why lots and lots of people love this book, but it just wasn't quite for me and to my tastes and what I like my books to do. First of all, actually, one of my favourite miniseries called Godless has a similar premise, which is that all the men in the town die in a mining accident, leaving just the women behind. I love that series, by the way, and you should go and watch it. But secondly, I'm bound to compare this sort of novel to, even though it's set in an even earlier period and it's set in Greenland, to one of my favourite novels, which is The Greenlanders by Jane Smiley. I really want to reread it this year. But there's so much in that book which I particularly love. Lots of daily life stuff, some monotonous detail which I just really appreciate. It has a real rhythm to it, that book. It has a unique style. We spend a lot of time with the characters. This one was more, I think, about the story, more about moving the plot forward. We focus on Maren, one of the women left behind, and she ends up falling for the wife of the man who comes and presides over the witch trials. So it's also a love story between these two women. I think if you love romance, you'll probably be a bit disappointed by this book because it's quite subtle and it doesn't completely take over the book. But for me, as a literary fiction reader, I thought it was well done. I would have liked to have seen the love story between two women already in the village, because I think that would have given me some of the things that I really wanted, which was more time with these women, more time with them, more experience of their lives, their inner workings. So this book will be for people. It just wasn't for me. We still had a great couple of discussions about this one. So yes, that's The Mercies. This was probably one of my favourite books from the last few months. This is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hammad, and it follows Sonia. I think her and her sister are Palestinian Dutch, but she lives in London. She's approaching her 40s. She's never been really successful as an actress, but she has managed to stay in work, and she's in a tumultuous period of her life. She's recovering from a disastrous love affair, and she decides she's going to go and stay in Haifa with her sister. It's where her Palestinian family is originally from, and she's going to try and lick her wounds there and also reconnect with her sister. Whilst there, she ends up being swept up a little bit against her will in a production of Hamlet, which is going to be performed in the West Bank. So she ends up spending a lot of time in the West Bank as opposed to Haifa. It's really difficult to pinpoint what is so great about this novel because it's quite subtly done, but it is a wonderful example of contemporary literature. And after a long string of new releases, which I was just less than impressed by, this reaffirmed my faith that people are still writing great literature right now, which I obviously know is the case anyway, but it did feel refreshing. It's a rarity, I think, to find a novel that is layered, clever, covering lots of difficult and nuanced themes, but it's also very readable. It's narrated by Sonia herself, and I was really instantly drawn into her voice. The prose is not overly complex or difficult to read, but there are real moments of beauty. Sonia's actly attention to the little moments of other people's body language are really beautifully done, really bring the characters around her to life. Actually, this is a novel about Sonia renegotiating and rediscovering her relationship to Palestine, which she has distanced herself from for being so painful, psychically painful, and in turn also obviously revisiting her relationship with her sister, with her family, and the sister dynamics between the two of them are very acutely observed as well. I also loved the inclusion of theatre. Drama and theatre were a big part of my life once upon a time, and it was so nice to re-immerse myself in that world. And I think Hammad does a really great job of capturing some of the power and the magic of theatre in this book, which is quite difficult because they're two very, very different forms. At times it slips into playtext, not necessarily even like the playtext of Hamlet itself, though that does occasionally appear, but she'll write a scene between Sonia and the other characters as if it were a play. And so I loved those little slightly experimental touches, pushing the limits of the novel form, but not in such a way as to be totally inaccessible. I think some readers will come to this book, read through it and think, well, what just happened? It has that still water prose which I've been talking about, but there's so much happening beneath the surface of this book. As we push towards the end, the tension begins to rise. And I think again, using this performance of Hamlet is a really effective plot point from Hammad, because she's able to bring Palestinians together who might not usually interact that much. Obviously Palestinians from the West Bank, Palestinians from inside the borders of modern-day Israel, like Sonia and her sister. Obviously Sonia also embodies another form of refugee status in the fact that she actually lives in London. And so bringing these characters together for that short period of time, for rehearsals, leading up to the performance, it just creates the perfect atmosphere for great fiction. It's one of those books which I finished it and wanted pretty much immediately to go right back to the top and read it again, just to see again the way Hammad builds some of these ideas slowly into the narrative. I'm really keen to pick up her debut, The Parisian, now. And I will be reading whatever she writes next. I think this book is a testament to her talent and I highly recommend it. Next we have a Miéville. We have China Miéville's Embassytown. This is a novel dense with many complex ideas, so apologies if I am not able to do it justice right now. This is a linguist's novel though. If you're a linguist, you must read this book because I think you will enjoy it. So, it is narrated by Avis. She is a human living on an alien planet in an alien city in a small enclave of humans called Embassytown. And obviously Embassytown acts as an embassy for a foreign human nation, the Bremen. The native peoples of this planet are called the Ariakai. They are an insecty type looking alien. There's a couple of unique things about this place. First of all, it's really, really far away from everywhere else. So Avis, while she feels nominally part of this human nation of which Embassytown functions as the embassy, she also feels quite a strong connection to this place because it's so far away from everywhere else. Second of all, the Ariakai speak a very unique language. It's language with a capital L. They speak it with two mouths, but that is by the by. It is not the unique thing about it. The unique thing about it is that it somehow has resolved or resolves the gap between a word and its referent, kind of. You'd have to come and join our book club discussion to get more into it. But essentially they can't lie. They can only say true things. They can only speak about specifics. Their language embodies the world. It is worldness. And so obviously the question Miéville is asking here is, well, what would happen if that form of language then comes into contact with lies, with humans, with our form of language? And that is the driving force of this book. There are so many ideas in here, obviously about language, but also about the entanglements of language and power and personhood and colonialism. And if you're interested in those things, it's a truly excellent novel. I also found Avis's voice to be compelling. I think it's a more successful novel for me than The City in the City. I think Miéville is on more familiar ground, being that this is a science fiction novel. He drops you in the middle of it. You have no idea what's going on for probably about 50 pages at least. There's a lot of jargon right at the beginning, so it takes a moment to scrabble and figure out what's happening. But you do get to a point where you do know what's happening, because sometimes you don't with these books. So you do get to a point where it does all start to make sense. And then about halfway through, it becomes much more straightforward. I think it probably has a few pacing issues. I think there could have been a touch more editing. But overall, a fascinating, strange and unique novel that I think touches on all of its themes in a interesting, clever way. Next we have another Annie Proulx. You all know I've been making my way through Annie Proulx's work. I love her prose style. I just love the way she writes. And so I've been reading through her body of work, and this is That Old Ace in the Hole. It follows Bob Dollar. His parents abandoned him when he was about 11 years old and left him with a eccentric but loving uncle. He's obviously a bit scarred from that event, and he's a young man at the beginning of the book, and he's not really sure what he wants to do with life, and he would love to make a success of himself and somehow prove to his absent parents that they were wrong to have left him behind. So he joins Global Pork Rind, a hog farming corporation, and they send him down to the Texas Panhandle to scout out spots for the next hog farm. Obviously, previous attempts at this have not been very popular with the local residents because hog farms are toxic to the water table, to the air, they absolutely stink. Obviously, industrial hog farming is not very ethical either in terms of treatment of the pigs themselves. And so Bob has to invent a cover story for himself, or kind of go undercover and scout out these sites. Proulx is not a proponent of industrial hog farming, but Bob Dollar is nonetheless presented in quite a sympathetic light. He's a bit naive, he's a bit traumatised. It is a bit of a late stage coming of age novel. This one goes off on so many tangents, it is insane. Whilst that is nominally the storyline of the book, we follow so many of the different characters, the history of the area. You really have to focus and try and keep them in order because it's easy to lose yourself. I read this also in dribs and drabs, and I wish I'd read it in a more condensed period of time because I think that would have helped. I do suspect there is a rhythm here to the way Proulx moves in the book, and I think on a second reading I would appreciate it more. But as it was, kept getting a bit lost in its meandering ways. So this is on a future reread list for me. There are some really memorable scenes from in here, which Proulx just writes with such precision and such love and such warmth. It's got a wry style to it all the way through, slightly mocking, slightly humorous, also at the same time a sense that she is recording these lives in a fictional historical way. I wouldn't recommend you start here with your Proulx journey. I would start with the Shipping News, I think. Or Close Range maybe, both of which I read last year. But if you're interested in more of Proux's work, I do think it's a worthy read still. You almost definitely know that I read and loved Gilead last year by Marilynne Robinson, so I was really looking forward to continuing the series. There's 4 books in total, and this is the second. This is Home. So where Gilead followed the Reverend John Ames writing a letter to his son, this book follows his best friend's family. It's not first person narrated like Gilead is. It is mostly narrated through the eyes of Glory, who is the youngest daughter in this family. And then of course there's Jack. Jack has come home, he is the prodigal son, he is the wayward son who has returned home to his father. He plays quite a big role in Gilead as well because John Ames is no fan of Jack. And so this novel is about these 3 characters, so the old man Borton, and his 2 children, Glory and Jack, trying to make sense of the past, trying to come to some understanding of Jack and why he has been as he is. The Reverend Borton is also dying, a bit like John Ames, so they're trying to do this on a bit of a time limit as well as he nears the end of his life. Glory is also reeling from her own issues, relationship issues. And so everyone's hurt and in pain and talking to one another and trying to come to some understanding and trying to reckon with the human soul and whether it can be saved and whether it can be forgiven and why do people do what they do? Why do some people behave badly? Why do some people find being good much easier? These are all the questions. Robinson just has a beautiful way with words. She will rip your heart out and stamp on it. I cried at the end of this book, of course. It is so sad. She obviously has real patience and love for other human beings, and she touches on some really important things in this book. I didn't love it as much as Gilead though. First of all, it's it's a little too long. Gilead is not as long as this. She went into such granular detail over some of these conversations that it became too much. It became almost unreal because it was so focused on such tiny little details. It felt a little repetitive at times. And also I felt like she didn't shift the story much at all in this book. I don't feel like I learnt actually a lot more about Jack than I did in Gilead. And of course there's a whole book called Jack, so I'm hoping that we'll learn more about Jack then. But I don't know that we actually moved in this book. It's more about the pain, and I wish that we had just had a little bit more progression in terms of the plot or the story. So I had a few niggles with it, but overall I love Robinson's writing and I will continue to read her, and I look forward to reading the other 2 novels in the series as well. We read Doppelgänger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein for our reference section, our non-fiction mini book club pick, and it was great. Some really good analysis in here of the contemporary world. So this book was born out of Naomi Klein getting mixed up with Naomi Wolfe online. So I'm just going to read straight off her Wikipedia because I can't put it better than this. But Naomi Klein is a Canadian author, social activist and filmmaker known for her political analyses, support of ecofeminism, organised labour, criticism of corporate globalisation, fascism and capitalism. Naomi Wolfe is a conspiracy theorist who also ends up kind of co-opting some of this language that Klein has traditionally used to criticise corporate globalisation and that kind of thing, but to bad ends, to conspiracy theory ends. She was a big anti-vaxxer, and since COVID has kind of gone off the deep end. And being chronically online as I was at that time, I remember this confusion between Naomi Klein and Naomi Wolfe. And anyway, Klein uses this as the seed for her looking deep into these alt-right spaces and trying to work out why someone like Naomi Wolfe, who wrote The Beauty Myth in the 90s and would describe herself as like a liberal feminist, falls down this rabbit hole and is co-opted into these alt-right spaces. And also obviously looking at the polarisation of politics and why nobody seems to be able to talk across it. If you are chronically online, I do think this book will help make sense of a lot of it. I think she makes some excellent points about why and how people do end up going down these alt-right paths, about how some of that can be laid at the door of the failures of leftist movements. And she goes into all sorts of different things with the core central idea of the doppelganger, tying it all together. So she looks at literature, she looks at some Philip Roth at one point, she looks at autism and Red Vienna, she looks at social media, online branding, she looks at Israel and Palestine. It's also very accessible, it's very accessibly written. She has this very personable writing style, which I gather is not typical of her books, and actually she went on a more personal journey writing this one. It's easy to digest, even though there's some quite big ideas going on here. I'm not sure she's saying anything absolutely new, but she's bringing it all together in an interesting and compelling non-fiction book. Overall, I would really recommend it if you want to understand a little bit of what's going on in the online space and what we could be doing better to fight some of this alt-right attitude. Next we have Ombria and Shadow by Patricia A. McKillip. I've shown this a few times, so I'm going to show it again because it's so beautiful. Look at this stunning cover. I took a brief lunch break there because the SD card got full. But back to Ombria and Shadow. At the beginning of the book, the Prince of Ombria has just died. What is Ombria, you ask? It is a dreamlike, strange city, and it is said that there is a shadow city lying somehow on top of, underneath, to the side of this city. The city itself, the non-shadow part, is strange itself. It's maze-like. It has this large undercity as well. Anyway, so the prince has died. He's left behind his 4-year-old son as his heir. Obviously, he's too young to rule. And a strange, mysterious sorceress who seems to be very, very old, called Domina Pearl, steps in to try and rule in his stead. Obviously, she wants power for herself. She kicks out the king's mistress, who had a lot of love for his son, even though it wasn't her biological son, and obviously seeks to remove the prince's nephew as well, Ducon. So that's our cast. And in the city itself, there is another sorceress who lives in this undercity, and she has a waxling called Mag. And Mag seems to have her own agenda, even though she's supposed to be serving this other sorceress. So there's lots going on, lots of dynamics. So in my written review, I described the prose as giving you the feeling like you're looking through the bottom of a glass jar. Like in the center of the image, you can see something in detail, whether it be the hand of someone drawing the young prince's puppets that he has lying around. These images are quite vividly wrought, but then around the edges of the text, it's quite blurry and blurred and unclear, and that's where the magic of it seeps in. So it's an unusual style because although it is dreamlike, there is a sense of embodiment to it. It is not totally away with the fairies. And also there's a real sense, even though these characters they're not psychologically real, fully fleshed out characters, there just simply isn't room and there's quite a lot of them. There is a real sense of the warmth of their relations to one another, and there's some beautifully written scenes between the young prince and his two protectors, essentially, in the mistress and his cousin. So that keeps this book just grounded enough to make it really lovable. It's romantic in the old sense of romance. It certainly has an older fantasy feel to it, more rooted in like the history of fantasy, I think. It's strange, you know, it's an odd tale and enjoyable in that sense as well. So all round, I was very impressed. I would like to read more MacKillop so I can like place this one a little bit better in my sense of her work as a whole. Because it is quite a unique little novel, and I definitely recommend giving it a go. I think it's best read fairly quickly, just so you can stay locked into that style and the dream of it all. I'm showing you this book to tell you I'm not going to talk too much about it. You may remember me holding it up and showing it to you in my March and April video, and that is because in this volume there are two books, The Shadow of the Torturer, which I read then, and The Claw of the Conciliator, and they're often put together in one volume called Shadow and Claw like this. They are the first two books in a quartet called The Book of the New Sun by Jean Wolfe. Talked about it a little bit more in that video, so you can go back and watch that if you are interested. Iconic speculative fiction books, iconic speculative fiction author, but I have concluded that I can't really talk to you too much more about this series until I finished it. I just need to get to the end and see how I feel about it as a whole and how all the parts work together before I talk too much more about it. Suffice it to say that I did enjoy The Claw of the Conciliator, like on just pure enjoyment factor, a bit less than The Shadow of the Torturer. I like when you have a big series like this, I like the setting up part, the childhood part, the introduction, I like all of that stuff, and we're stuck in the middle of the journey here, so yes. But it so much feels like a part of a bigger whole that it's going to be difficult to talk about it until I finish the whole thing. So I will get back to you on that. I feel a little similarly about this. This is Ship of Magic. It is the first in the Live Ship Traders trilogy. I read the Farseer trilogy last year and loved it. When I came to this one, I did really miss Fitz. He narrates that first trilogy and I love him. This one follows a cast of characters and we go through their different perspectives. So I really missed him at the beginning. I did come to love this cast of characters as well. And as I read on through it, I began to see Hobb's maturation as a writer, getting to grips with the bigger cast and moving between the perspectives and putting this slightly more complex plot line together. I think she does really well. All the good bits of Hobb are here, so it is at once enjoyable fantasy with really well written characters, feels psychologically real and thus very frustrating because humans are frustrating at times. It's just good to read. But at the same time, some interesting themes that she brings in about gender and feminism, about class, about power, about faith, the limits of faith. And you get some surprising results which you might not otherwise expect in a book of this kind. Anyway, we're very much in the middle of the story here, so I do need to continue the series to see it as a whole. I love the way she expands the world here. In general, I just love Robin. Thanks to a number of members of the book club who championed her books. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, another novel published this year. This book is about Cyrus Shams. He is an Iranian American. He has experienced a lot of tragedy in his life. He's lost both his parents by the time the novel opens. He lost his mum in a particularly tragic accident where an Iranian passenger plane was shot out of the sky by the US Navy, which did actually happen. It was a real event. When we meet him at the beginning of the book, he is in recovery. He is newly sober, and the whole book is essentially him trying to figure out how to be sober in this difficult, painful world that we live in. It's a big, chaotic mishmash of things, this book, because we have Cyrus's perspective and Cyrus's storyline. We also have Cyrus's poems. He is a poet, as is Kaveh Akbar. In order to try and overcome his insomnia, Cyrus sometimes imagines, as he's trying to fall asleep, dialogues between two figures in his life, and these can be fictional figures or real figures, and it helps him drift off to sleep. And so we have some of these dialogues which are very strange. I think we have one between like Lisa Simpson and his mum, and a Trump-like figure and an artist who plays a big role in the book, and his father and the poet Rumi. We have a little interlude which is the story of another Persian poet. So there's lots and lots in here. It has this wry, humorous, if you don't laugh you'll cry kind of tone to it. It's a bit silly and chaotic, and I think it's generally quite polarising in that respect. So I really liked this book. I found it to be quite a vulnerable piece. I don't know how much of Akbar is in Cyrus or the other characters in the book. It feels like Akbar is laying his heart bare in this book and really fundamentally not holding back. And I think a lot of it hinges on whether you like Cyrus or not, because he is angsty, being newly sober. It's almost like coming of age again. So he's kind of fresh and raw and vulnerable to the world, and he's sometimes not very likeable. Though Akbar is a poet and you might expect a certain type of novel from a poet, this has a lot of plot. I watched an interview where he talked about how he watched a lot of movies while writing this to learn the art of good storytelling, which I think is really interesting, because I actually wrote in my notes as I was going, like, this feels like a movie. In fact, the plot is almost ridiculous, but as I said, I quite like its ridiculous nature. But I definitely, having now heard that, I can definitely even more so see the touch of movies and film in this book. I think it's an interesting thing to say, it's an interesting thing to do, rather than reading lots of novels or perhaps genre fiction, I would suggest to anyone trying to write good stories. I'm sure he does also read a lot of novels, but I think it adds an interesting lens through which to see this book as well. To borrow a cinematography metaphor. At the same time, this really polarised us in book club, because we did this for our hype list mini book club, so like new releases. Some of us just found it super annoying, really contrived and trite, and I totally see where they're coming from. I think all of that is there as well, but I couldn't help but really like it and enjoy it anyway. He touches on a lot of stuff here, you know, American imperialism and obviously, you know, addiction and recovery. I haven't even told you about why it's called Martyr, but Cyrus wants to die a meaningful death, or figure out like how to die a meaningful death, basically because his parents died such meaningless ones. And he explains to us as well that martyrdom and the idea of the martyr is important to Iranian culture. I even forgot to tell you, like, a lot of it is narrated from his mother's point of view. In fact, some of the loveliest parts of this book are those moments. You can see there's just so much in here. Does all of it sometimes feel a bit shoehorned in? Yes. Did I nonetheless enjoy it? Yes. But I think you'll either love this one or really not get on with it at all. This is North American Lake Monsters by Nathan Ballingrud. You may know that I read and loved his novel, The Strange. I think it was his first novel, The Strange, last year, which is just a lovely, nostalgic love letter to sci-fi and westerns. This is quite different. It's quite bleak, for starters. First of all, though, I do love this cover. I don't know why, but something about it really appeals to me. So naturally, each story features a monster. These are like horror adjacent, I would say. They're more uncanny and vibey than they are out and out horror. So be warned, horror fans. But the monsters, whilst an integral part of each story, the main focus is on the human characters in this book. And each of them, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are difficult, traumatized characters. They make poor decisions, but I think Ballingrud is quite clear with us that this is because of structural neglect, lack of love, lack of human connection, and he seems to want to show us the monster within, or perhaps the ways that monstrosity is created by the world we live in. The blurb says, sometimes they're ruined, sometimes redeemed. They're always recognisably, wonderfully, terrifyingly human, even at their most monstrous. There's an elegant pared back style to Ballingrud's writing here, and I think you could write some wonderful stuff about the relationships between the actual monsters and the monsters within the humans themselves. There was just something missing from this book to really push it and elevate it that little bit further. They all felt quite tonally similar, which served to flatten or dampen them a little bit, even though we're following quite different stories, quite different characters. I would have liked to have seen more variation, perhaps more range there. I think in some ways it didn't go quite even dark enough, which I appreciate Ballingrud perhaps didn't really want to go there, but to really get that light and shade feeling in the stories. However, I think it's a really accomplished collection. I will be reading whatever Ballingrud comes out with next. I'm interested to see what he does because these, as I say, these stories are quite different from The Strange, but we shall see. Next we have Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I listened to this one. You may remember I listened to The Warmth of Other Suns not too long ago. This is her second book, and in it she makes the case that race in America particularly is a caste system. This may or may not sound obvious to you, and she does this by comparing and contrasting with the Indian caste system and the treatment of Jewish people under the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany. I think this book would serve as a fantastic introduction to anyone that is slightly new to some of these ideas. The fact of there being no biological basis for race and helping them to see race and racism in a different light, particularly obviously within Northern America. And I think the first parts of this book do that really well. I think Wilkerson makes her case really convincingly. She has a real talent for bringing like academic concepts like this into a very readable, digestible, popular non-fiction. I think it falls down a little bit compared to, say, The Warmth of Other Suns, because it is just impossible to encompass all three caste systems and really get into it and get into the detail in a book of this size and in this kind of format. And so it becomes a little simplified, especially I think with regards to Nazi Germany and the Indian caste system at times. I think it made for a good listen. I do like listening to non-fiction. It's read by Robin Miles, who also read The Warmth of Other Suns and also reads the Broken Earth trilogy, so I'm very familiar with her voice now, and she does a great job of narrating it. But yes, I think a wonderful introduction. I think perhaps if you're looking for something even more in depth, you might want to read more or read around it. Final book, which I just finished this morning, and I've obviously got my art copy. I have got a nice hardback, which I should probably have gone to get. Anyway, I just finished this morning. I was listening to it. This is The Book of Love by Kelly Link. I don't know what to say about this book. Honestly, I have absolutely no idea who I would recommend this book to, but let's start with what it's about. It's about a group of teenagers, 4 teenagers. They are brought back from the dead mysteriously and tasked with something, they're not really sure what. The implication of the outcome of the task seems to be that 2 of them will live and 2 of them will go back to being dead. And they're given this incomprehensible task by a couple of strange and mysterious figures, one of whom was their high school music teacher. So it opens quite vaguely, as you can imagine from my brief summary there. And then what follows is many hundreds of pages or many hours of teen angst, teen sex, just dynamics, arguments, just a lot of angst. So much angst. To the point where it feels young adulty at times, but at the same time it's quite spicy, so don't give it to young teens in your life. And with a bit of magic thrown in. It takes ages to get to the point. It's repetitive. It's so slow. It could have done with a good 200 pages off at least. However, after I'd got many, many hours into it, I just ended up wanting to know what happened, absorbed in the characters and their lives, but I'm not sure it's entirely worth it. I think it's on Storygraph. A review, someone saying this was like a fever dream, and I can imagine if you read this really quick, like you really burned through these 600 pages quickly, you would feel like you had been immersed and in a very complete and whole world with very complete and whole characters. But yeah, as it is, I'm not sure I can recommend that it's worth your time. You would have to sit down for many hours to do so. I honestly think Link is just such an interesting and strange author. She's a genre-bending author, going into the weird, into fantasy, into sci-fi, into fairy tale. I read White Cat, Black Dog last year. Is that what it's called? yes, and really liked it. This is her first novel, and she's always written short stories before. And a number of years ago, I DNF'd a collection of hers called Get in Trouble, which I do keep meaning to return to. So I've had an up and down relationship with Link thus far, and I'm just so intrigued as to one of the questions I always ask myself when I come to a book of any kind, really. I end up asking it implicitly without really thinking about it, is why did the author write this? Like, what is... And it's usually much easier to work that out. For example, That Old Ace in the Hole is obviously trying to make a record of Texas Panhandle life. Home by Marilynne Robinson, she seems to be working something out over the course of the whole book by reiterating and iterating the same story of Jack and the difficulty of forgiveness. She seems to be working something out, and I'll try and find out what that is over the course of the 4 books. Martyr, like I said, feels like a cry out into the world by Akbar. All of these books have, in my mind, quite logical reasons for their being, but this one I just have no idea how and why it exists, or why Link would write a novel like this after she's written stories like she has done, what drew her to this story, to these characters, whether she started writing it a long time ago and has now returned to it. Yeah, it's one I can't work out, which is frustrating, but also makes the book interesting to me, and is a little bit why I definitely wanted to finish it and see what happened in the end, to see if I could make sense of it, but I couldn't. Lee Bardugo on the front of this one says, you won't realise you're drunk on the Book of Love until it's too late, and you're careening from the spectacularly weird to the wildly funny to an aching grief you're almost too familiar to bear. A dizzying dream ride you will never forget. Now, I don't know if I agree with absolutely all of that, but I do think there is something intoxicating about this book, just from the sheer amount of words and the detail you get about the characters' lives. That is Book of Love. And I also read the second book, Terry Pratchett's second book in the Discworld series. I listened to that as well. Delight fantastic. Had all the same problems as I did with The Colour of Magic with it. I initially thought we were going somewhere because it did have a semi-linear plotline, but then it devolved into chaos again. I know that people say these first 2 books are not as good as what comes after, so I am going to keep trying. Do I fear that Pratchett's style isn't for me anyway? Yes. But I will keep going, I will keep trying. Sounds like someone started to smash glass next door, so I'm going to investigate that. And don't forget about my HelloFresh code. You can use the QR code on screen, or you can use my code SUNBEAM6025 and redeem your free dessert for life. And yes, that's everything. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye.